All right, welcome. So, this is our second lecture in the topic of developmental psychology, and what I'm going to be lecturing on today is social and personality development. So, if you've ever wondered, how did you become the person that you are today? What has contributed to your personality? What has contributed to your ability to form friendships and get emotionally close to others? What has been responsible for um, really how you relate to other people and how you see yourself. So today I'm going to be lecturing about some of the early childhood influences on on several of those things. So after hearing this lecture, I hope that you'll be able to describe examples of early signs of social understanding in childhood, understand the importance of early attachment and individual differences in attachment, including how attachment styles are studied, be better able to describe four parenting styles and know the outcomes associated with each, know outcomes associated with divorce, know the influence of peer relationships in social development, be able to describe the association of temperament with personality development, and then explain what social and emotional competence is and describe the marshmallow test, one of the more famous set of experiments in psychology. Okay, so just an overview. I'm going to review early forms of social understanding. I'll then talk about family relationships, particularly the importance of parents, um, how infants form an early attachment to a caregiver, how that's measured in psychology using a research paradigm, and then the influence of different parenting styles, not only in establishing attachment, but then other outcomes through childhood and adolescence. Talk about the importance of peer relationships and how peer relationships contribute to the development of personality. Um, talk about personality, just a very quick overview. So, personality is something that I'll discuss and lecture on in subsequent modules, but I'll talk about the very early beginnings of personality. And then at the very end, I'll just very, very briefly talk about social and emotional competence and how that develops. So, understanding social and personality development requires looking at a child from three different perspectives. And these three perspectives or these three factors all work together to shape a child's development. And so the first thing to look at is biology and the biological maturation that supports a child being able to develop their social and emotional competence that ultimately underlies their temperament and their personality. So last lecture, I talked quite a bit about biological maturation, and so you have to consider biology as a basis for developing one's personality. And I'll throughout the lecture I'll kind of come back to that theme as well. But as we've already learned in this class, and as I've lectured on in previous lectures, in order to understand social and personality development, it's of course not just biology, but there's a very, very important role of a child's environment. And so when we consider the environment, or what is psychologists often refer to as the social context, that is the environment that involves people, you have to consider the relationships that a child has, um, and particularly the importance of the relationships with early caregivers and parents, because this really shapes the basis for a child's attachment, their feelings of security, what they know about themselves. So this comes from the relationships that children have in their environment. But then the third thing to consider is a child's developing sense of their self as well as their social world. So it's not merely biology and environment that kind of act on the child, and this is a theme that I talked about last time as well, but at some point, as a child grows, they start having their own wishes and their own intentions, and they start to intentionally and with purpose act on their environment, which usually involves their parents and their peers. So while parents might have a particular style, um, a child will interact, and in many ways, there's the dynamic interplay between a parent and child. So we can think of who we are today as being this continuous interplay and interaction among these three factors. All right, so let's talk about social understanding. This broadly refers to understanding one's social world, basically understanding other people and how to interact with them. Okay, so how does this develop? Well, interestingly, uh, of course, relationships are essential to this, is that we come to understand other people through the relationships that we have. And much of our understanding of others is determined by the early relationships that we have in our life. Those will often serve as models for interpreting our relationships with others. Um, so, very interestingly, there's early signs of social understanding. And even before 1 year of age, infants show an awareness that other people have thoughts and feelings that affect their behavior. This can be observed in a process that is called social referencing. This is where people consult the emotional expressions of others to determine how to evaluate or respond to uncertain situations. And so, even very little babies do this. Infants that are around 1 year of age, or even a little bit younger than 1 year of age, show an awareness that other people have thoughts and feelings. Okay, so infants will go through this process of social referencing, in which an infant will look in their caregiver's face when confronted with an unfamiliar person or an unfamiliar situation. If the mother looks calm, the infant will be calm. If the mother looks stressed out, the infant is likely to become distressed because the mother is, or the other caregiver is signaling that the situation might be dangerous. So, observing infants interact with their caregiver shows that they're able to read and understand the emotions of others. Now you'll see that there's this hyperlink here, and this is also presented in Canvas. You can go ahead and check it out now if you want to by pausing this video and clicking on the link in Canvas. What you're going to see in this video is something called the still-faced test, the still-face test. What you'll see in the video is a little baby, probably about 1 year of age, maybe a little bit younger. The baby's interacting with her mother. At first, the mother just interacts normally and makes eye contact and kind of plays with the baby. But then, after 3 minutes, as a part of the experiment, the mother gives the child a still face. That's why it's called the still face experiment. It's basically just a blank look. There's no reaction. There's no emotion. And what you're going to be able to see is just how stressed out the baby gets. Okay? So after about 3 minutes of first interacting, to then get a non-responsive, expressionless mother, the baby rapidly becomes uncomfortable and starts to make repeated attempts. Try to say like, hey, let's get this pattern going where you show me emotion, I show you emotion. When the attempts of the baby fail and they can't get the mother or the other caregiver to show emotion, most infants tend to withdraw and will end up orienting their face and body away from their caregiver and just kind of act hopelessly. And so this still face experiment has been replicated many, many times. It's one of the more replicated findings in developmental psychology. And so what it demonstrates is that very, very young infants have many of the basic building blocks of social understanding. It suggests that they have some sense of the connection between what we show on our face and emotion. And it also shows that they're able to regulate their own emotion to some extent. So by trying to re-engage with a caregiver, it suggests that they're able to regulate and even engage in some very simple goal-directed behaviors related to social relationships. So very early indication that we come into the world very well equipped to understand others. Now, something that we've already taught, or I've already lectured on, is something called theory of mind. Theory of mind is an awareness that other people have their own thoughts and intentions, and these intentions affect their behavior. So this is very important for understanding others and having relationships, is to have an appreciation that other people have their own thoughts and they have their own intentions. So there are signs that a theory of mind develops by about 1 year to a year and a half. Last lecture, I showed a video about a specific test of theory of mind called the false belief test. What this video shows is that most children are able to pass this specific false belief test by around preschool age. But there's evidence that children begin to develop a theory of mind when they're even younger. So for example, if an 18-month-old baby, okay, year and a half, if they watch an adult repeatedly drop an object into a cup, try to like drop like a ball into a cup, and the adult fails on purpose, right? They'll immediately then grab that little object like a ball and they'll put it into the cup if they're given the opportunity to do so. So this is kind of a simple test to show that a baby that is a year and a half has some appreciation that the adult, the other person, had a goal, was trying to do something, that the adult has their own intentions. Okay, so you have to be creative when you study kids that are pre-verbal. They can't talk, so you have to look at their behavior, and you have to make some inferences. But that type of a test, by giving a little baby the opportunity to complete a task that a adult failed at, is taken as evidence that a baby is developing a theory of mind that other people have intentions. All right, now let's talk about attachment. Attachment is a deep and enduring emotional bond that connects one person to another. So we can talk about attachment as psychological connectedness, a deep and enduring emotional bond. Virtually all infants that live in normal circumstances develop strong emotional attachments to those that care for them, usually mothers and fathers, but it can be other caregivers. So this is really assumed to be an innate ability, that is something that we are born with. So early attachment is not simply a byproduct of a parent providing food. So in other words, infants don't become attached to their mother simply because the mother provides them with milk. Rather, it's thought that attachment is a development from our evolution, that the ability to form an attachment is necessary because, evolutionary speaking, a child should be motivated to stay close to them, to stay close to caregivers that take care of them and get all the benefits associated with those close relationships. So security, warmth, and then even learning and guidance later on. But how do we now know that attachment and the ability to form attachment is an innate ability versus something that is learned? This was actually something that was much debated in psychology's earlier years. So around the 40s and the 50s, the 1940s and the 1950s, psychologists and I should say even earlier. So let's just say for several decades, I think starting in the 20s through the 40s and 50s, but don't worry about the dates. Um, there were two main theories that psychologists proposed that were that they said uh, are related to how children form attachments. And so the first one was based on a learning theory. What this suggests is that we form an attachment to our caregivers based on a set of learned behaviors. So the basis for learning attachment to a caregiver is the provision of food. So an infant initially forms an attachment to whoever feeds it. They learn to associate the person providing the food, usually the mother, with the comfort of being fed. And this is a process called classical conditioning, which I'll lecture about in a couple more modules. Okay, so this came to be known as the cupboard theory, like you get food out of the cupboard. But the idea was that we don't start with an innate ability to form an attachment. It is something that we have to learn. Now, this idea or this theory was contrasted with an evolutionary theory of attachment. And what that said is that children come into the world biologically pre-programmed to form attachments with others because this helps them survive. So one of the early proponents of the evolutionary theory was Harlow. What he said was that attachment develops as the result of the mother providing tactile comfort, which he called this contact comfort theory. Okay, the mother providing basically warmth, a soft touch. Okay, the tactile is touch, right? So he suggested that infants have an innate biological need to touch and to cling to something for emotional comfort. So beyond the need for food, we have a need for um, the, for touch. Really, we have a need for touch. So the learning theory of attachment would suggest that infants only form an attachment with a caregiver that provides food. Harlow wanted to put this idea to the test, and he did this with newborn rhesus monkeys. So um, we could say that it's a species that is somewhat close to us in our kind of evolutionary lineage. Okay. So here's a link, and you can check this out to see. This is an overview of what happened in the study, and it's got some very old footage from when he originally did this many decades ago. But in a series of experiments, he demonstrated that attachment is really about contact comfort or tactile comfort. So in his studies, he took newborn rhesus monkeys that were separated from their mothers at birth, and he raised them using these surrogate mothers that were made out of wire. So the infant monkeys were placed in cages that had these two wire mothers. One of the wire mothers held a bottle from which the infant monkey could get food and get nourished, while the other wire monkey was covered in a soft terry cloth. So what he found is that the infant monkeys would go to the wire mother to obtain the food, but they spent most of their time, most of the day, on the soft cloth mother. He also showed that in a series of experiments, when he did things to frighten the monkeys, they would go run and turn to the cloth mother and would cling to them for comfort and security. So this was taken as evidence that for the contact comfort hypothesis, that we form an attachment, and this attachment is not one that we learn based on getting food or nourishment from a mother, but that we have an innate ability and a need to have touch and comfort, and that is the basis for forming attachment. So while it's the case that nearly all children develop emotional attachments to caregivers, the amount of security that they have in that attachment differs from child to child. And so there are individual differences in attachment. So this has been studied using a research paradigm called the strange situation. So this is developed by developmental psychologist Mary Ainsworth. It assesses differences in a child's attachment style. In particularly, it measures a child's security of attachment, which is the child's confidence in the sensitivity and responsiveness of a caregiver. So in Canvas, you can click on this hyperlink, and I suggest that you pause this video and do that now. But what you're going to see is that this research paradigm of the strange situation follows a basic sequence. First, a parent and a child come to a laboratory and they interact together alone in a room. There's toys. They just have a normal interaction. The child gets to explore the room with their primary caregiver there supervising. A stranger enters the room then, talks to the parent, and then approaches the child. The parent then leaves the room, and the child is left in the room to interact with the stranger. The parent then returns to the room. And it's the parent returning to the room that is the critical part of the strange situation. And what developmental psychologists do is they observe what is the child's reaction to the parent when the parent enters the room. So from this task, researchers classified a child's reaction into 4 main categories, and these then become or assess a child's attachment style. So here's the 4 main types of reaction. So most children, and this is about 60 to 65% of children, you would imagine, become distressed when the caregiver leaves, but then are quickly comforted when the caregiver returns. So this is called a secure attachment style. Upset when the caregiver leaves, but when the caregiver returns, can quickly calm down. However, about 20% of children are classified as avoidant. What happens is that they don't seem overly distressed when the caregiver leaves, and they also don't have much of a reaction when the caregiver returns. So they just kind of avoid the caregiver and don't really seem to care too much about their caregiver leaving. Okay. It's an estimate, but fewer, so somewhere between 7 and 15% of children have what is called an anxious resistant attachment style. So these children become very distressed when the caregiver leaves, but then they can't be calmed down. So they're not calmed down by the caregiver returning. In some cases, a child might actually passively reject the parent by refusing comfort, or may openly display direct aggression towards the parent, hitting or swatting at the face. And then the least common reaction is known as disordered or disorganized. So this is only about 5 to 10% of children. So this is some non-conforming mixture of attachment behaviors. So in other words, it's difficult to categorize the child in any of the first 3 categories. So children may be considered securely attached in a first observation, but then in other observations, they show signs of either being avoidant or anxious resistant. So their style is kind of all over the place. It's disordered, it's disorganized, and it kind of had to fall into its own category. So while there are these 3 different categories of avoidant, anxious, resistant, and disordered, as a group, these 3 have been referred to as an insecure attachment. Okay, so there's secure, which is most kids, and then insecure, and then the insecure attachment can be further differentiated into these 3. Now, Um, how do these styles develop? So the research paradigm is this one-time interaction, but how did children get to be this way, where they have this reaction when they interact with a stranger, and then the parent comes back? Well, of course, all has to do with the parent's behavior that has led to the child forming one type of an attachment versus the other. So, when caregivers respond in a consistent and appropriate way to their child's needs, this leads to secure attachment, right? So, if a child is crying, the caregiver comes over and says, "Why are you crying? Are you hungry? Do you need a diaper change? What is it? Okay, are you struggling with something? Can I help you?" So, when a parent is consistent and acts in an appropriate way, a child learns that their caregivers um, will support them when that help or support is needed. So that results in a secure attachment. Okay. Now, if a parent is unresponsive to their child's needs and often neglects their child's needs, children will develop an avoidant attachment. This is because children learn that their caregiver don't support them and won't be available for help when they need it. So they don't learn to depend on their parent. And so a child may demonstrate avoidant behavior, such as ignoring a parent. It is thought as a defense mechanism against possible rejection from the parent. So parents that are unresponsive to child's needs leads to a child that has an avoidant attachment style. Now, when parents are inconsistent in responding to their child's needs, this can result in an anxious, resistant attachment. So, a parent might respond in an inconsistent way. So, sometimes they respond, sometimes they don't. A parent might respond in an inappropriate way. So, not providing the right type of support. So, providing love and affection when what the child needs is, some other type of help, like getting a diaper change or something like that, or being fed. Um, so, this leads to an anxious, resistant attachment because the child has learned that the parent is sometimes there, but won't isn't there to reliably help them when they're in need. So much like avoidant, they've learned that they can't really trust a caregiver. And so a disorganized attachment style happens when a caregiver has very extreme or erratic behavior. This results in a disorganized attachment because it makes it very difficult for the child to form a coherent coping strategy. So, children that are abused or raised in poverty, have alcoholic parents, often will form this disorganized attachment. Um, Now, this attachment style is important because it serves as a basis for self-concept, that is how one sees themselves, for self-esteem, for one's worldview, that is um, the type of parenting style that a child has will often serve as a model for social relationships later in life. So, children that have a secure attachment to their primary caregiver are more likely to be able to form secure attachments with others, friends, and romantic partners in their adolescent and adult years. Conversely, people that have one of the types of insecure attachments to their primary caregiver have a more difficult time forming relationships and friendships in their adolescent and adult years. Okay, so indeed, what we see are research has shown that these attachment styles that characterize um, child attachment are these same four are found in adults as well. And so I think this is something that you can reflect on either for yourself or if you're currently in a romantic relationship and things are going well or things are not going well, you might look at some of these descriptions and say, oh, this really matches me or this really matches my partner. Um, so and this can refer to both romantic relationships or platonic relationships. So platonic relationships don't involve sexual intimacy, but so these can refer to both. Okay. Um, so a secure attachment style is, of course, ideal. Um, People that have a secure attachment style as adults have a positive view of themselves and they have a positive view of others. And so, a securely attached person, and you can see what your own answer response to this statement would be. Um, but securely attached people tend to agree with statements like, "It's relatively easy for me to become emotionally close to others. I am comfortable depending on others and have others depend on me." Okay, and securely attached people typically report the most satisfaction in their relationships. Um, let's see. Now, as adults, people with an anxious attachment style have a more negative view of themselves, but a positive view of others. So, people with an anxious attachment style tend to agree with statements like, I want to be emotionally intimate with others, but I often find that others are reluctant to get as close as I would like. Or statements like, I'm uncomfortable being without a close relationship, but sometimes I worry that others don't value me as much as I value them. So you can see that the model that um, they learned from their parents, that they've kind of wanted to, they have this anxious style from inconsistent parenting, is that they want to be close to others, but they sometimes had a parent, it was inconsistent, it was sometimes inappropriate, and so this leads to this anxious style of wanting to be close, but just being unsure, right? Valuing others, but not having a good sense of self. Um, so again, people with this anxious style seek high levels of intimacy, and they're looking for approval from whoever that attachment figure is. So that could be a friend, that could be a romantic partner. Um, so compared with securely attached people, people who are anxious and preoccupied with attachment tend to have less uh, positive views of themselves and often feel anxious about their relationships. So they're just often in doubt about each other. Now, in terms of avoidant, these would be adults who you could say as children just learn not to rely on their parents, and so they don't rely on other relationships as well. So, so interestingly enough, they have a positive view of themselves and a negative view of others. So they've learned to be independent. And so they'll agree with statements like, I'm comfortable without close emotional relationships. It's important for me to feel independent and self sufficient. I just prefer not to depend on others. So they have a high level and need for independence and attempt to avoid um, attachment altogether. So these might be people that say, "Yeah, I just don't need close relationships. I don't need anybody. I don't rely. I don't need to rely on anyone." Um, so they generally avoid close relationships and distance themselves from others. Okay, and then finally, there's people that grew up with this disorganized attachment style, um, people that grew up in impoverished conditions, in poverty, had other traumas, may have been abused in some way. Um, they tend to have this very unstable and fluctuating view of themselves as well as others. And so they'll tend to agree with statements like, I'm somewhat uncomfortable getting close to others. I want emotionally close relationships, but I find it difficult to trust others or depend on them. I worry that I'll be hurt if I allow myself to be close to others. So these folks tend to feel uncomfortable with emotional closeness, um, and have mixed feelings about relationships combined with sometimes negative views about themselves and their relationships. Um, these people commonly view themselves as unworthy of close relationships, don't trust other people's intentions, um, and therefore they often seek less intimacy in their relationships and are much less comfortable expressing affection. So, um, fortunately, most people grow up with a secure attachment style, and as adults have a secure attachment style. It is fewer people that have either an anxious avoidant and even fewer that have a disorganized attachment style. But the models that we learn as children and what we're able to, to see from our parents, kind of our worldview of what relationships look like, potentially have consequences into our adult years. I say potentially because it's not completely deterministic. That is, there can be um, people that don't have secure attachments with their primary caregivers, but then through forming relationships with others, whether that's friendships with peers, whether that's finding a kind of a surrogate adult that can be an alternate model for what a healthy relationship looks like. It's not. It doesn't have to be one's fate to grow up as an adult with an attachment style that is based on one's parent. Okay, but research does show that the same types of attachment styles that are found in the very early years are also present in adults. So again, um, if you're wondering, if you're kind of reading some of those descriptions, if some of those statements you find yourself agreeing to, there are, by the way, you can go on the web and you can do some uh, assessments of attachment style, um, thinking about your own upbringing, and then potentially with friends or with partners, trying to understand what was their childhood like and what type of an environment did they grow up. That can help explain either the need for intimacy or rejecting intimacy or being uncomfortable with intimacy. Um, much of it is rooted in our early childhood years. All right, so that's attachment. Um, and again, much of that is rooted in some of those early childhood years. As children mature, parent child relationships naturally change because as children become older, they start elementary school, they're more capable of starting to do things on their own and they start having their own preferences. Um, and much to my chagrin, my 7-year-old starts to even refuse requests. Okay. And so, as a parent, your style necessarily must evolve as as your child ages. Okay. And in having a relationship with a child, it's very common for there to be conflicts. So, uh, this recognition has led psychologists to come up with um, kind of four main characterizations of different parenting styles, which can be, um, which is seen in this table, and they can be described according to two main factors or dimensions. So the first dimension is based on warmth and responsiveness. That is the amount of um, care and comfort that a parent gives, as well as how responsive a parent is to a child's needs. The other dimension is expectations that a parent has for their child, as well as the amount of um, control that a parent tries to exert on their own child's behavior. Okay, so you can think of both of those dimensions as kind of very simply being either high or low. So that is, a parent can um, be highly warm and responsive, like give a lot of love to your kid. That's the way I think about it. Okay, so a parent can give a lot of love to their child or not so much. Okay, they can also have high expectations and high standards, but also be very prescriptive, like set rules and have boundaries, or not. And the combination of being high or low on both of those two dimensions characterizes four different parenting styles. So let's start with authoritative. So, an authoritative parenting style are parents that have high but reasonable expectations for their child and their child's behavior. They're also warm and responsive, so they show love. They communicate frequently. When there's conflict and when there's problems, they use reasons rather than punishments, as when a kid, acts out, you could say. So authoritative parents tend to be supportive of their child's interest. They show interest in the kids' activities, but they're not overbearing, and they allow their children to make constructive mistakes. As you might expect, children that are raised by authoritative parents show greater competence and self-confidence in their childhood years. Okay, so they're just better at social relationships, they're better at school, they have higher confidence, higher self-esteem. So the most positive outcomes socially and academically are found for children that have authoritative parents. Okay. Now, authoritarian parents, on the other hand, have high expectations for their kids, but they lack kind of the love and the warmth. So their authoritarian parents are very focused on obedience. And so it would characterize an authoritarian parent to say, um, why do you need to do this? Because I said so. That's why. I'm the parent. Because I said so, just do it. So reasons aren't given. The rule is because I said so, and not why a rule is the rule. So an authoritarian parent is not interested in any way in explaining, communicating, or negotiating or making a compromise. They're strict. They're super strict. Parents are authoritarian. This creates somewhat of a problem because they tend not to allow kids to get involved in solving their own problems or in coming up with solutions to different obstacles. Instead, an authoritarian parent is more likely to make rules and enforce consequences with little regard for a child's opinion. And so they're very frequently will use punishments, and often harsh punishments. Outcomes for children that have authoritarian parents are less good. So children of authoritarian parents are at a higher risk of developing self-esteem problems. And this is because their opinions, it's never been shown that their opinions are valued. Interestingly, they are also more likely to become hostile or aggressive with others. And the thinking here is that this could be some way to exert control in their own lives because they don't have it in their home environment. They might be aggressive with other peers or children as a way to um, seek control outside of the home. Okay. Moving on to permissive parents. Permissive parents may try to act more like a friend than a parent. They're unlikely to have many rules. They're often quite forgiving when a child messes up. They often have the attitude, well, kids will just be kids. Okay, so even if there's undesirable behavior, oh, kids are just kids. Now, on the one hand, there's some very positive aspects, is that they tend to be high in this warmth dimension. So um, they often encourage their children to talk about their problems with them, which is good, but they usually don't put much effort into discouraging poor choices or discouraging bad behavior. Um, and so, with permissive parents, there can be some consequences for children as well. So, children of permissive parents are more likely to struggle academically. They also may exhibit some behavioral problems where they don't really appreciate authority or rules or needing to follow the rules. Um, it, they're also at higher risk for health problems like obesity, often because permissive parents don't really have limits on the type of food that can be eaten, and so there's consumption of junk food and things like that. Okay, and then finally there's uninvolved parents. So here there's a lack of warmth, a lack of comfort, but also a lack of rules. And you could say that children here just don't receive much guidance, much nurturing, or much attention at all. Essentially, uninvolved parents expect their children to raise themselves, and they don't devote much time or energy into meeting a child's basic needs. Sometimes this neglect happens. It's not always intentional. So you can have a parent that has mental health issues, a parent that has substance abuse problems, and they're just not capable of attending to their child's physical or emotional needs on a consistent basis. There's other times that parents just simply lack knowledge of child development and what to do. There can be other circumstances in which parents are simply overwhelmed by life, needing to work multiple jobs, managing a household, as they just might not have the time and the ability to be involved in their child's life. Um, Unfortunately, there's several negative outcomes. So children that have uninvolved parents are likely to struggle with self-esteem issues. They're likely to perform poorly in school, and they're likely to exhibit frequent behavioral problems and often report low levels of happiness. So, by far the best outcomes are for children that have authoritative parents. All right, now you might be wondering, what about divorce? Divorce is very common, especially in the United States, and how a divorce could potentially affect a child in terms of their self-esteem, their self-concept, their academic achievement, their view of relationships, etc. So been a large number of studies looking into divorce, and most of this was done in the 80s and the 90s. What much of this has found is that children with divorced parents tend to score lower than children that have had continuously married parents on several measures, including academic success, behavioral conduct, psychological adjustment, self concept, and social competence. Okay, so it's important to know, however, that the size of these differences are pretty small. So while children of continuously married parents do tend to score higher in these areas, it's not a very big difference. It's also important to know that some studies show that divorce has positive consequences for some children, but that would be in a specific set of circumstances. So, for example, when there's very intense and chronic and overt conflict between parents, in other words, parents are fighting all the time and it's in front of the kids, um, that creates a very aversive home environment for children. And so in these cases, divorce actually has positive consequences for children. Now, this is the minority of cases, though. It's only a small number of divorces that are characterized by this very intense conflict. And that's the reason why there tend to be better outcomes for continuous marriage versus divorce. But it's the small number of circumstances when there's very, very overt conflict and abuse and things like that, that it's much better for children to have their parents divorce if the conflict is that intense. All right, so let's move on to peer relationships. So for sure, parents are a very important relationship for children, especially early on. But then as children age, and they move into their elementary school years and then their adolescence years, and certainly in high school, um, peers become and peer relationships become a very important um, part of being able to develop socially as well as form the basis for one's personality. So even in the very early years, in the preschool years, peer relationships allow for several things. One is foundational skills. So in the very early years, in preschool settings and in kindergarten, children learn foundational skills for managing conflict, like being able to take turns and to be able to compromise. Playing with others also involves needing to coordinate behaviors and activity. And so this forms the basis for things like being able to share, being able to compromise, being able to negotiate agreements. Um, Joining sports teams also teaches teamwork. So being able to uh, work towards a common goal, to be able to trust others for support, to be able to learn to give as well as receive support from others. So it's several places from the early preschool years throughout the high school years. Peer relationships and are really important for establishing foundational social skills. However, peer relationships can also be very challenging, and this is particularly true as children age. Unfortunately, children often experience bullying, and being on the receiving end of bullying can have important consequences for self-esteem, self-concept, and being able to trust others. Um, there's also the case that as children age, they need to confront peer pressure, feeling pressured to fit in, to do what other people are doing. There's also a process of social comparison. And particularly as we age, we use others as a reference to evaluate our own competence, whether that's socially or whether that's academically. So other people can either be a source of positive kind of regard for oneself or self-esteem, or it can comparing oneself to others can make us feel not so great. Okay, and so that too happens at a very early age, comparing who has what toys, who has what clothes. As we get into adolescence and high school years, who's performing well in school, um, who who has a car, who doesn't, all of these things, who has more friends. Um, so peer relationships, while they teach the foundational skill, can also be very, very challenging, and it can create um, real challenges for developing one's self-esteem, particularly through these types of social comparison processes where we see people that are better off than us. And then I'll say that adolescence is kind of a special time in terms of what we learn in adolescence for our social and emotional competence. In adolescence, more than our early childhood years, is really the time that we learn psychological intimacy with others. And so, in particular, during adolescence, this is often where we share things with others, like our secrets, where we practice learning to be vulnerable with other people. It's also where we first start to understand and experience things like loyalty and betrayal. So, a child that is going through maybe like a tough time at home that discloses something to a close friend about, hey, this is something my parent said to me, or this is something my parent did to me, but I'm only going to tell you, please don't tell our other friends. Okay? that experience can go very well, or that experience can not go well at all. So if they get support from their friend and their friend trusts them with that secret, that becomes a basis for establishing trust, and it can even form a model for how other friendships will go. However, if that trust is betrayed, the friend shares the secret, that can, potentially kind of erode that trust and becomes a model for um, future relationships as well. So adolescence is really, in some of those formative experiences in adolescence of learning to be vulnerable, learning to be psychologically intimate, learning to be a loyal friend, or getting betrayed can um, can have repercussions into the adult years. All right. So how does personality develop? Well, you can see that we've kind of been talking about different aspects of personality along the way, but more specifically, we can say that we just can describe personality as an individual's characteristic emotional nature, including energy level, prevailing mood, and sensitivity to stimulation, and this is referred to as temperament. And so this is really, infants are born with a particular, little babies are born with a particular temperament, which is described according to two major dimensions. The first is reactivity, which is how easily aroused, excited, or irritated a baby is. So some babies are just very calm. They're chill. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what other people are doing. It doesn't matter the Senate. They're just kind of, they're just chill. Others are very reactive to their environment. And so whether it's other people, they can get very excited for the good. They see a parent's face and they light right up and they're so happy. Or they can get fussy really quick. If they can't reach for a toy, if things are, something that is bothering them, they can get upset. So you can think of that as kind of a continuum of, being reactive to one's environment, okay, both in a positive and a negative way. Okay, so just being kind of more versus less sensitive to what is going on in one's environment. And then there's another dimension of self-regulation, which is how well an infant or a child can manage this tendency. So for instance, some children get upset very easily, but they can calm themselves down. They can self-soothe. Okay, so you might put them to bed in a crib, for example, and they're very upset. They react very strongly, but then they can also calm down very easily and they can self-soothe. Other children show less of a capacity very early on for this self-regulation and are not as capable early on to be able to regulate their reactions to the world. Okay. So temperament is really these emerging differences in reactivity and self-regulation, and this serves as the foundation for our personality development. So it is thought that these very early differences that we see in babies ends up being the precursor, the very early precursor to our adult personality, which I will lecture on in a couple modules. So temperament has a very strong biological foundation. If it didn't have a biological foundation, you wouldn't see it in some of the first months of life. So it does. But it's important to know that temperament and biology is kind of not the end-all be-all. It doesn't necessarily determine one's personality. But it does determine the kind of experiences that we're likely to have. So for example, a baby who is more fussy, okay, that is more irritable and reactive to their environment and might have less of an ability to self-regulate, that might result in more severe parenting practices than an easygoing baby. And so it's important to talk about the idea of fit, which is the fit between one's biology and one's environment, a fit between nature and nurture. So we can talk about fit as being a match or a mismatch between a baby's temperament and the characteristics of the child's environment. So let's just say, for example, you've got a baby who is biologically prone to fussiness or irritability. That might not be the best fit for a young first time mother who lives at home with other relatives and other siblings in a chaotic environment. There's not enough personal space. Um, that could be very difficult. And so that fussy, irritable baby might be on the receiving end of some less nurturing and more severe parenting practices. Um, Not definitely, we're just talking about like likelihoods, right? You can have same situation, it doesn't happen, but just talking about likelihoods. On the other hand, if you have a baby who is the same type of baby who is prone to irritability and fussiness, but they're born to two parents later in life, um, stable environment that simply have more time, ability, and competence to provide more nurturing caregiving to what would be like a tough baby. Like, oh my, my baby's real fussy. Like that's difficult. But a more experienced parent is going to react with much different parenting style and practices than, say, a first time parent under not ideal circumstances. And so that reaction then becomes um, the basis for the child's behaviors, which are then the basis for the development of personality. You could just also think about a baby who is just very highly reactive and needs a lot of stimulation, and they're just active, active, active. Okay, an active baby. But they're born to parents that are more sedentary. They're couch potatoes. They like to sit around, don't leave the house. They, um, like to watch TV, as a for example. So that's likely to create some that's not the best fit. That's likely to create conflict. That conflict between what the child wants to do, to be active, to do stuff, and the parents' kind of their own personality, is likely to then create conflict, which will shape a child's behaviors and personality into the um, early childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood. So it's really about thinking about the importance of fit and personality being this continuous interplay between biology and environment. We're born into the world a certain way, but whether we end up developing a personality that is a kind of a match or a mismatch for that early temperament really depends on the environments that we're born into. Okay. All right, so the last thing that I want to talk about is the idea of social and emotional competence. So we can think about conscience as acting consistently with our internal standards of conduct. Okay, those internal standards of conduct often come from the rules that our caregivers give us or that other authority figures, like a teacher, will give us to say, as a child, you know that there's certain rules and you know that there's right and wrong and you know that it's not okay to hit another child or it's not okay to snatch at another child's cookie, right? And so that's kind of the early beginning of a conscience, is to know that there's rules that are then internalized and then either acting in a consistent way with those standards of conduct. Okay, just ignore this for a little bit. So it turns out that temperament is involved with the ability to form a conscience. As I just discussed, some children have more versus less of an ability to regulate themselves. So effortful control is this inherent ability to regulate one's behavior, which is something that develops through life with practice. And so biologically, some children are just more capable of monitoring and regulating their own behavior, engaging in effortful control. Um, and some children just really have a difficult time regulating their own impulses. So here again, the idea of environmental fit comes into play. Children that are more biologically predisposed to have difficulties with self-regulation might struggle to develop a conscience if they don't have the proper parental support, in terms of parents being responsive in communicating and enforcing uh, rules and standards and expectations. So, in other words, a child that might have more difficulty with self regulation, if they have a very attentive parents that really work with them to say, here's the difference between right and wrong. This is acceptable. This is not. Um, there's absolutely the potential to develop a conscience, but children that uh, we could say have less of an ability to self-regulate and also don't get parenting behaviors that would encourage that will have more of difficulty in doing this. And in future modules, I'm going to lecture on personality disorders, including an antisocial personality, which is basically having very low empathy for others and engaging in criminal behavior. Some of those early precursors to antisocial personality disorder could have to do with one's biological proneness or disposition towards that, as well as the environment that a child finds themselves in early on. Okay, so one specific type of social and emotional competence that has been studied fairly extensively by psychologists is known as the delay of gratification. This is the kind of effortful attempt to put off or delay um, engaging in a behavior that we would find rewarding. Okay, so we have to delay our gratification all the time. If you have to work, if you're in school, there's all kinds of other things that are much more rewarding, whether that's playing video games or watching TV or spending time with friends. But we often have to put that off and we have to focus on other things. Well, the marshmallow test is a very famous experiment or a test in psychology that was developed by Stanford psychologist Walter Mischel. What he was interested in doing was testing um, preschool age children's ability to delay their gratification. He really wanted to kind of understand the cognitive, kind of these mental strategies and tools that kids would have by basically giving them a willpower test. And so in this test, it's called a marshmallow test because a marshmallow or some other desirable treat, okay, it could be an M&Ms, it could be a piece of candy, but marshmallows were kind of famously used. This desirable treat is placed in front of a child. And the child's told that they would get a second treat if they just resisted eating the first treat for 15 minutes. Okay? If they couldn't resist their temptation and they basically ate the first marshmallow, they wouldn't get a second. So it's kind of this test to say, hey, 2 marshmallows better than 1, and they did all kinds of tests to make sure that that really was rewarding and valuable for the kid, that they really did want that second treat. Okay, so it was a way to say like, hey, you could get that second treat if you can only wait. If you can only wait, you can have double what you have now. And Walter Mischel was really interested in saying like, how do kids deal with this? Okay, it's very difficult for a preschool age child to wait 15 minutes to delay their gratification. So he's like, he really wanted to see how they did it. Now it turns out that what really made this set of research studies famous was that he did research in the 90s where he did this longitudinal research that is following up with children over time, and he found a positive correlation between when the amount that a child was able to delay eating the marshmallow when they were in preschool, and then several outcomes in adolescence, namely parents' ratings of social competence, as well as SAT scores at ages 15 and 18. So, in terms of social competence, for example, he had their parents answer questionnaires, and he found that the kids that delayed longer when they were preschoolers were rated by their parents in their adolescent years as being more likely to exhibit self-control in frustrating situations, less likely to give in to temptation, They were rated as more intelligent by their parents, less distractible when trying to concentrate. So, several measures of social competence, as rated by their parents, that were predicted by how long they were able to delay eating the marshmallow in preschool. Okay, and there was also a positive association between the length of delay as a preschooler and how they scored on the SAT at 18. And so people were blown away. When this came out in the 90s, people were absolutely blown away because the results were taken to mean that if we can only teach kids to delay their gratification, to be more patient, to have greater self control, they'll be able to achieve these same benefits, just like the kids in the study. Um, and indeed, what we saw is that there's all kinds of interventions and programming in schools that teach delay of gratification. They're incorporated into the school curricula. Some of you might have gone through social and emotional competence training in your elementary uh, years. Those of you that are parents might have your child at a school where this is part of the curriculum. Um, it even appeared on Sesame Street. Even Cookie Monster has been used to teach delaying gratification. Um, the problem, however, was that the studies that he did, the sample size were very small, and it just so happened that the people that participated were the children of very well-educated and wealthy parents. They were recruited through Stanford, so these were like the rich families in Palo Alto. Um, the finding with the SAT only involved 35 people. So interestingly enough, the study was replicated just a couple of years ago in 2018. Many more participants, something like 1,000. Interestingly, they did kind of find similar results. They found that for each additional minute that a 4-year-old was able to wait and delay their gratification, to wait for the treat, it did predict their academic achievement on a standardized test. But the effect was really, really small. Okay, so like for each additional minute, it's just like a very small amount that would like show an improvement on the standardized test. Um, Interestingly, they found that most of what explained the difference in academic achievement could be explained by whether a child was able to delay for just 20 seconds or more. So children that could only wait, that could not even bring themselves to wait for 20 seconds, they did much worse on the standardized achievement test than children that could wait longer. So basically waiting 1 minute versus 5 minutes versus 7 minutes, it didn't matter at all. So they did find that if there was anything, that kind of real kind of impulsive behavior of grabbing that marshmallow or other treat before 20 seconds was related to academic achievement. However, and this is important to know, when they took into consideration, this replication study in 2018, when the researchers took into consideration other factors like home environment, the child's ability on other types of like cognitive ability tests, the effect completely went away. Their performance on this delay of gratification test didn't explain academic achievement at all. Basically, academic achievement got completely explained or overwhelmed by factors like home environment, parent education, how good they are at other types of achievement tests. So the conclusion was that delay of gratification is not necessarily this unique skill that is going to have these big consequences um, later in life. There's I think, unfortunately, other factors that are play a much more important role. And this has to do with, unfortunately, socioeconomic status, the environment that a child lives in. Those are much better predictors of academic achievement than this delay of gratification. So Just some stuff to know. You've maybe already heard about the marshmallow test. You're likely to see the marshmallow test in other places. Um, what we can say is, to be sure, among preschool age children, you see all kinds of individual differences in the ability to delay gratification. There's absolutely, at a very early age, a different set of abilities among children. Whether or not that early ability to delay gratification ends up predicting future outcomes, I'd say research hasn't established that. Okay, Walter Michel's research, it certainly did in the 90s, and that stimulated quite a bit of interest in it, um, in this idea of delaying gratification, social emotional competence. More recently, I would say that the evidence is less clear. So I think that that's important to know. But it absolutely is the case that you see differences in children's impulsiveness, and their ability to be patient versus not. Um, whether how a child is at age 4 ends up then predicting their academic achievement at age 15. Um, I think the jury is still out on that. So, okay, that's it for the lecture. I hope you enjoyed learning about some of these things. I hope that it gives you some amount of insight into the way that you are, and thinking about your upbringing, your parents, your friendships early on. Of maybe some of the way that you are has to do with those early childhood experiences. So I hope it gives you more insight into yourself as well as some of your friendships. Okay, thanks for watching.